On the eve of a polarizing and contentious election, you probably have some enemies. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus called us to love our enemies, but to do so, we have to acknowledge that we have an enemy. Only then can we grapple with their actions, invite them to lay down their animosity, and open a path for healing, reconciliation, and unity. Join Sycamore Creek for this 5-week series to learn from Jesus how to have an enemy.
So, Tom, Melissa Flora Bixler says that if we're to have enemies well, we first need to understand them. So, Tom, Melissa Flora Bixler says that if we're to have enemies well, we first need to understand them.
Understand your enemy.
Understand your enemy.
We're like on opposite sides of the court here, so I have to understand you.
Yep.
If you're to be my enemy.
Yep.
I read a book a long time ago, and I've been waiting forever to use this story in it. It's a novel called The Brothers K. And do you know the reference?
I've only heard of this book from you, but I have heard of the Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah, Dostoevsky, classic book that nobody really wants to read. But
no, I haven't read it.
Actually, I read up to the Grand Inquisitor, and you could just read the Grand Inquisitor by itself and not read the rest of the book. That's the best part of it. So anyway, but it's also, the K is a play on the slang for strikeout.
Okay. No, I didn't know that.
Not your baseball.
No,
yeah.
no.
So you teach me hockey terms. I teach you baseball terms.
Basically.
We really should be filming this on the baseball diamond, I'm realizing.
There's time for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So K is strikeout, Brothers K, because the Chance family's dad, the dad in the story, was a Major League Baseball pitcher, but he got injured, and so he's not pitching anymore. Mm-hmm. And there's 6 boys in this family.
I can't imagine having 6
boys.
Nope.
I can't imagine having 6 kids, period, boys or girls. But you got 6 of them. The second youngest, his name is Erwin, and Erwin is just this like beautiful, guileless, fully devoted.
Okay.
Actually, they're Seventh-day.
Okay.
Actually, they're Seventh-day Adventists, so they're very, very strict and literal in all their interpretations. It's set in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, and Erwin gets drafted to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
And of course, one of the 10 commandments is, "You shall not murder." So one day, while he's with his platoon, there's a young Vietnam boy or young man who comes in with explosives, and someone in the platoon catches him, and the captain gathers together the platoon and is trying to kind of work them up into a frenzy so that he can order this young Vietnamese man, young boy, executed, which of course you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to take him as prisoner of war, but so he's like, now I want to hear from you all. Why would a boy, if that's what he is, walk into a camp? So one soldier says, well, of course he's trying to kill us. And that's what the captain is trying to get after. And then there's a bunch of other soldiers that chime in with the same basic thing. And then it comes to be Erwin Chance's turn to answer. And this is where I'm going to read from the story. Chance squinched his eyes shut, gripped his temples in his big right hand, and blurted out with the confidence of some yokel who's just seen his Lord and Savior, I really think I know why he did all this. We killed his dad, I bet. Or his brothers. We killed his sister and mother. If they were dead, he'd do this. Because put yourself in his shoes. If you were a kid and your family was dead, if you were a kid and we killed him, isn't that just what you do?
Wow. So he's taking some time to try to understand his enemy there.
Yeah, I mean, in a very bold sort of way, but he's also doesn't really get what he's saying in the context. And here's how his platoon reacts. Mm-hmm. The men weren't just stunned by this outburst, they were pole-axed. I love that word, pole-axed. I'm going to try to use that this week in conversation. They were pole-axed. A few squirmed as if a priest or maybe somebody's mother had walked into the tent.
They didn't want to understand their enemy. They didn't want to understand their enemy.
They sure did not.
No. But like we said, Melissa Flora Bixler says that if we want to have enemies well, we first need to understand them.
Yeah. I mean, the key word there is well. Like,
right.
You can have enemies.
Yeah.
Not very well.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do it Jesus' way, you're going to have to first start with understanding them. Mm-hmm. So today what we're going to look at is a particular kind of enemy. Not a sports enemy, not a war enemy,
sure.
Although maybe in history sometimes a war enemy.
Sure.
But enemies across different faiths. Interfaith enemies. And then enemies within the faith. Like, the first one is like maybe you might talk about Christians and Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever. But then there's intra-faith enemies, enemies within the same basic religious tradition, like Methodists or Lutherans or Catholics or Baptists, or in the case of the Brothers K, Seventh-day Adventists.
Right.
And what we're going to learn today is that there's an airplane flying overhead.
It sure is.
So what we're going to learn today is if we want to have faith enemies well, we have to first understand them, but then we have to also draw the line.
Right.
Which is why we're at the line here.
Right.
And you're about to draw the line to not film in 40-degree weather outside.
I sure am.
Yeah.
I sure am. Well, let's pause here for a chat question. How do you respond to this idea that we first need to understand our enemies? Take a minute and talk about it. So, Tom, we're in, as you know, the beginning of an 18-month-long deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount, where we're exploring topics that Jesus introduced in the Sermon on the Mount, and those topics are inspiring our sermon series.
Yeah.
And we also have small groups that are going along with this, engaging various resources, also that we can look at what Jesus has to say in the Sermon on the Mount.
A deep dive.
Deep dive.
Into Jesus' most well-known teaching. And this particular series is called How to Have an Enemy. And it's based on a book by Melissa Flora Bixler of the same name. And I'm going to be interviewing her in a live stream on November 3rd. And so people can tune in on all our channels and ask all the questions they want, which I'm going to have a million questions to ask her too.
Yeah.
Because I'm glad I didn't write this book.
Yes. And Jesus had a lot to say about enemies, about our anger, about all of these different kinds of things. And I'm really glad that he had some things to say about that because, we've got the election coming up in just a couple of weeks. And we know that like 50% of the country will be our enemy. Like even if I don't see someone as my enemy, they probably see me as an enemy.
Yeah. You can guarantee that somebody out there who voted differently than you sees you as their enemy. So it seems like a good opportunity or good time to actually study what Jesus said about having an enemy and doing it well.
So here's what he said. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven.
For God gives God's sunlight to both the evil and the good. And God sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much.
If you're only kind to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect.
All right, so as we said, we're going to talk about faith enemies. And Christians over the centuries have made Jews their faith enemies, unfortunately.
And we're going to keep coming back to this quote over and over and over again. But Melissa Flora Bixler, like we said, she said, if we're to have enemies well, we first need to understand them.
So let's explore the enmity that developed amongst sort of reform movements of Judaism in the early centuries. And Christianity is one of those. Christianity was originally a reform movement inside of Judaism. It was the minority who was arguing with the majority of Jews.
Right.
This inner debate, ended up blowing into full-blown anti-Semitism in Western Christianity. But early Christianity wasn't the only reform movement going on in Judaism. There's all kinds of other reform movements going on at the same time. For example, the Essenes, who were like monastic monks living in the desert of Qumran and maybe other places, but we've scholars and archaeologists found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been this huge treasure trove of information about first century Judaism. So they removed themselves completely from society and lived out in the desert. Then there's the Pharisees. The Pharisees followed an oral tradition on top of the Torah or the teaching of the Old Testament. And then there's the Sadducees, who were like the Roman collaborators in charge of the temple. So they had like an interest in keeping the status quo, so that the temple kept functioning. Then there's the scribes, who wrote commentary on the Torah. And then we have the historical movement of Jews across the whole Mediterranean and the whole world that is usually referred to as the diaspora. And it's in the diaspora that you have the rise of the synagogue, because obviously if you're a long ways from the temple, you can't go to the temple. You go to the local synagogue. Now, in the midst of this historical movement, Christians, as a reform movement inside of Judaism, ended up eventually becoming the majority movement, or majority in general, in the Mediterranean and the Western world. And Jews and Judaism become the minority. And the things that you would say as a minority reform movement inside of Judaism, when you add to them the power of the majority, become, well, really problematic.
Sure.
Really, really problematic.
Yeah.
So eventually you have the two reform movements that survive sort of antiquity, is Judaism in the synagogue and Christianity based around the church, which we don't usually think of ourselves in that way, but that's certainly the way that the New Testament thinks about Christians, as being grafted into Judaism.
So it's helpful to understand when we're reading the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' words here, that Jesus is living into this well-worn tradition of being a prophet who's criticizing the majority. This is the context of his words.
Yeah. An example of that is the prophet Isaiah, who's in the prophets are always in the minority. That's why you can't ignore the minority in any group. Majority rule is not a biblical way of thinking about it, because you pay attention to the minority, because the prophets are often in the minority. And Isaiah says this to the majority: "Trample my courts no more. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and calling of convocation. I cannot endure your solemn assemblies with iniquity." Yikes, those are some strong words.
Yeah. And we see evidence of this throughout the Gospels, throughout the accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. Particularly, we can see this in John's account of Jesus' life and ministry. He says this: "For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him," that's Jesus, "because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God." So it's helpful to know when we read that in the book of John, he uses that phrase, the Jews, like 70 times.
Yeah.
And he's talking about the religious leaders of the day. So that's who was looking to kill Jesus.
So again, you think about the minority and the majority there. Like, Jesus is a minority prophet speaking to the majority, and the majority, but they're all Jews.
Right.
They're all Jews.
Right. So this brings us back to Melissa Flora Bixler saying that if we're to have enemies well, we first need to understand them. So all of this insider debate among the Jews is boiling down to this, that Jesus had an issue with the way some folks were observing the Torah and sort of separating their observance of it from the meaning of it. He wanted them to have the practice and the meaning both at the same time.
So let's take a pause here and give people a chance to reflect a little bit. So here's a question for you. What has helped you understand people of other faiths? Take a minute and let's talk about it. probably people who are listening to us at this point are wondering, why is all this conversation or this emphasis on Jesus, Jewishness, that important? Like, why? Well, it's really important for those of us who are Christians in the West. And the reason for it is this. When I was at seminary, I studied under a guy named Richard Hayes, a very well-known New Testament scholar. During the section on the historical Jesus, Richard Hayes emphasized that if you say really only one thing about Jesus, you can say that Jesus was a Jew, period.
Right.
And it's sort of this reclaiming of Jesus' Jewishness. And the reason that's important is because in the 20th century, the center of biblical scholarship and theology was in Germany. And this program in Germany, this theological and biblical program, was to erase the Jewishness, to sort of whitewash the Jewishness out of Jesus, which turned not only a blind eye to what Nazi Germany was doing, but ended up undergirding theologically the whole anti-Semitism of Europe and the West, which led to the genocide of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so Western theologians and biblical scholars have been working to reclaim Jesus' Jewishness to make sure that we don't end up back in that spot again. It's sort of one of the ways that we're wrestling with our own complicity in what happened so horrendously, sort of the blooming of anti-Semitism into genocide.
Yeah. And if you're not aware of all that backstory, it might be surprising that there was such violence, such tension between these two groups that are really pretty close together theologically.
Yeah.
Melissa Bixler says, "It isn't unusual for our most intense conflicts to occur with those closest to us, those with whom we share much in common." Yeah, I mean, we could just think about anticipating Thanksgiving dinner with our family after the election, and like the tensions will probably rise around politics.
All right, we're going to take a turn here because the enmity between Jewish reform movements, Christianity and Jews, which is Judaism is what it's ended up in today, reminds us of much of the enmity between Christian groups today.
Right.
The intra-faith enemies.
And again, we're back to this line from How to Have an Enemy, where she says, if we're going to have enemies well, we first need to understand them.
I got another story from a book about somebody going to extreme lengths to understand their enemies. It's a nonfiction book that I've been listening to. Actually, I finished listening to it, called Boy Mom by Ruth Whitman. And Ruth Whitman is a very committed feminist. She wants to raise her kids to be feminist kids. She's a researcher, she's a writer, and in the process of having kids, she ended up with 3 boys. And this has made her go back and reflect on her own ideological commitments and convictions to understand who are these human beings that she's raising that happen to be boys. And so she writes this book called Boy Mom, where she takes her feminist ideological perspective and really puts it under the microscope, or puts it to a test by going and interviewing a bunch of different groups of men or places where men congregate that might be considered classic enemies of feminists.
Right.
So like an all-boys school, or incels, which is, if you don't know what incels are, it's maybe not even worth Googling, and we're not going to take time to explain it right now.
Yeah.
But one of the more surprising chapters was when she goes out to Utah to visit this masculinity training home. And it's run by conservative people of faith, and it's for boys and men who are struggling in life, and it's to help them know how to become a real man. And what she finds there is really surprising. She expected it to be sort of classic toxic masculinity, and what she found was that the emphasis was on these men getting in touch with their emotions. But they were reframing it as emotions being strong,
Right.
which is still kind of into that sort of traditional masculinity. But sort of beside herself, she ends up kind of liking the guy who runs the house.
Mm-hmm.
Through the whole book, I was really impressed with her commitment to build relationships across those lines
Right.
to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge commitment. So what Whitman does is really admirable. And it takes a lot of resources. Not all of us can do that, but we do have an opportunity here at Sycamore Creek to engage across the political divide through dialogue with people from our community. It's an opportunity just to hear from other people and understand people who are coming from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. It's happening today.
It is happening today.
November 17th.
And you do have to sign up for it.
Yeah,
because space
there's
is
limited
limited.
space
Yeah.
at Buddy's and Holt.
Yep.
So Melissa Fleur Bixler gets at why this understanding is really important when she says, disinformation is a scandalous source of enmity. When prejudice and assumptions define the cause of our strife, we have departed from the gospel. Sometimes that disinformation is unintentional, but sometimes it's intentional. And disinformation doesn't lead to understanding.
Right.
It's not having an enemy well.
Right. So we might summarize Jesus' way of having faith differences well as first naming a real difference. Like we're not going to ignore the difference or try to gloss over it, pretend that it doesn't exist. We're going to take time to understand each other and then name those differences.
There's real differences here.
Yeah. And then number two, we're going to refrain from tropes or distortions. So, we all have access to those little sound bites that maybe are kind of snarky. They don't really accurately portray the perspective another person has, but they kind of make us feel good that we don't have that perspective. So we're going to refrain from using those. And number three, we work against using power, ours or our enemies, like to oppress people.
This is a really important part because oppression is power plus prejudice.
Right.
Or prejudice plus power. You can't really oppress someone who you're prejudiced against if you don't have power. The oppression comes only when you pair power with the prejudice. When you prejudge someone and you have the power to enforce your prejudgments.
Yeah. So if Jesus is telling us that we need to love our enemies well, then maybe it's good for us to ask, where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
Because we're not going to be tolerant of intolerance, and we're not going to use power to subjugate or oppress people who are on the underside of power.
Yeah. It's kind of like you're stepping up to the plate with your bat and
Right.
you draw the line.
Draw the line.
You're like, pitcher, you're not getting past this. All right, we're going to go back to an old debate. This is like inside the Reform movement of early Christianity with Judaism. And the early Christians were all Jews. And so they really thought that someone, well, let's just say men, should be circumcised first, which is to say they should become Jewish first
Right.
before they can follow Jesus. And Paul, one of the early missionaries, and he's the one who's actually out in the Mediterranean with
Right.
the Gentiles being people who are not Jewish, who's realizing this is not going to work. Like, I mean, imagine like how few people would be willing to follow Jesus if adult men had to undergo circumcision without anesthesia.
Yep.
Yikes.
Yikes.
Like that might be a line too far. So Paul's the liberal in this debate, and he's saying, listen, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised for them to be followed. They don't have to become Jewish first. And this isn't just tolerating Gentiles by the Jewish Christians. This is using, like, they had a whole like council. They gathered together at Jerusalem between Paul and the Jewish Christians who are like the Jerusalem Christians who are like the really Jewish
Right.
Christians. They're like the conservatives in this debate. And Paul eventually wins out, thankfully. Thank you, God. I think a good case could have been made, or could be made, that this would have been oppressive for this council at Jerusalem to use its power to say, no,
Right.
Gentile males have to be circumcised to first follow Jesus. So this is not just tolerance. This is like using power to include.
Right. Melissa Fleur Bixler talks about like the difference between just tolerance versus active inclusion. She says this: Churches err when inclusion and tolerance mask conflict as a way to avoid the costly work of anti-oppression. So when you use inclusion and tolerance and you're just ignoring the real differences that are there, well, that actually doesn't help anybody. That's like a go along to get along kind of mentality that ultimately winds up doing more harm than good.
There's often in Christianity, especially maybe in the more conservative side of Christianity, this call for unity amongst Christians, and we're just going to sort of ignore the really problematic differences.
Right.
And I think this is what Melissa Floor-Bixler is pushing against, and Jesus is pushing against. No, there's some real differences here, and they have real negative impact on people.
All right, so let's pause here for another chat question. Where have you seen the church or any organization err so far into tolerance that they ignore oppression? Or where have you been tempted to do so yourself? Take a minute and talk about it. So Jesus and Paul really draw a line with those in power, and they stand with people who are on the underside of power.
Yeah.
We've talked about one example of this already with circumcision, but there's another example, and we see this argument that happens in Corinth. And Paul writes to the church in Corinth to talk to them, because what had been happening was that there were rich Christians who were gathering at the communion table and eating all the communion bread and getting drunk on the wine before the people who were less well off, the day laborers, even got off their shift.
Yeah. It's a little hard for us to imagine this today, because communion, the way we do it today, is very sort of symbolic meal. This was like a real meal.
Yeah.
It's much more like church in a pub or church in a diner, and it's like all the rich people had cleaned out the kitchen and the wine cellar.
It's like a potluck or something.
Yeah, something like that. So Paul says this: "For if you eat the bread or drink the cup without honoring the body of Christ, you are eating and drinking God's judgment upon yourself." Eeh. What exactly is he saying here? He's saying, like, if you eat it without honoring the body of Christ. I don't think he's actually talking about like the bread and the wine. He's talking about the people. Like he's taking the side of the people who are like the day laborers who aren't showing up yet.
Yeah.
The poorer Christians.
And it's from this teaching, this argument, that we get one of the most beautiful passages in all of our scriptures.
"If I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing.
If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing."
Now, this is a passage that's often used in weddings. And this is like the next part's the classic love passage. And I always encourage couples, or just anybody reading it, to put their name in the place of love. So love is patient is the first line of it. You might say, Tom is patient, or Mikhail, and you can kind of like ask yourself, like, how well am I doing at loving?
Right.
Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs.
It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends.
Riffing on this, Melissa Floor-Bixler says this: "Love reorients life toward those without power. Love eliminates the structures of hierarchical authority that dominate people's lives. And it is here, when social stratification is eliminated, that a community of love can flourish." I think like what we're trying to do is remind people of the context of this beautiful passage. It's in the context of poor Christians being left out that Paul is reminding the Corinthians that this is what love looks like. And I think he's also reminding us that the church should be a demonstration plot for the reign of God, for what is really real. I think about the Asbury Garden at our Eastwood campus. It's a community garden. All the food is given away. It's kind of a demonstration plot. It's like a foreshadowing of what the reign of God is, where everybody has all the food that they need.
Yeah. So followers of Jesus are working to remove the structures, the systems, the cultures that oppress people and keep them on the underside of power. So we might sum it all up in this way. How to have faith enemies well? Well, number one, you work to understand, and then you draw the line at oppression.
All right, I got a great story from church in a pub. This was before you came to Sycamore Creek. We used to gather at Buddy's in Holt every Monday night and do a kind of unusual church service. And we would eat the meal, and so the servers were there, is like preaching while they're weaving in and out. When we'd serve communion, I'd just order wine and bread, and they'd bring it out to the table, and it was an absolutely beautiful kind of way of being community outside of the four walls of what we think of as a church building. And I would always remind people that came that usually when you come to a restaurant, the servers are there. They literally have in their name the servers to serve you. But when the church comes to the restaurant, our goal is to serve people. And so we're there to serve them. So yes, they're serving us our food, but I mean, the really sort of most practical way is let's not become known as the stingy church meets on Monday nights at Buddy's because we don't tip well. So tip your servers well. But it also is like your whole posture, attitude towards the servers, and getting to know them as human beings. And there was an older, grumpy attender who was kind of known for not doing a great job at serving our servers. And one night, she stepped over a line. Yeah. And the line she stepped over was that she swore at an Asian young woman who was serving, and she threw food at her. And that was a line that I couldn't
You had to draw
tolerate.
the line there.
Yeah, I had to draw the line. So I told her that you can't come back to church in a pub until you write an apology to the server. And she called me just about every week for several months, asking if I still was holding that line. And I said, yeah. And her health turned bad at one point, and she called me and asked that again, and I said yes. And she said, okay, well, I'm ready to write it. I said, well, write it and send it to me. Let me see it. She wrote a really beautiful apology. It was very heartfelt, and I gave it to the server. Server really appreciated it, and then we welcomed her to join back in church in a pub. And I think that sort of story summarizes well kind of what we've been talking about. There was a line, like we weren't tolerant of everything.
Right.
But we did work to restore the relationship, and we worked to understand one another. I would hope that all of our campuses could be demonstration plots like that example of church in a pub.
Demonstration plots for how to have enemies well.
Yeah.